All right, so opening it up to the panel, one of the first questions is just, how do you believe that medical education grants differ from the typical clinical grants, and how would you factor that into your grant applications?
So I think oftentimes educational grants have a couple different components that are important, especially if they're being reviewed by education researchers. I think theory in a theoretical framework or a conceptual framework are critically important to your work and are often not something that you'll see in a clinical trial or in health services research. You want to make sure that things are well based in the literature, both theoretically and in the past, though I would say that oftentimes there's perhaps less available empirical studies for some of the ideas that we're working on. I'd also say that you'll often see more mixed methods, which means qualitative and quantitative approaches. You know, I think historically educational research has been sometimes of a smaller scale, but I think that is in the process of changing as it's become more professionalized. But I think the big ones are that you're going to be looking at things from a social scientist approach, a humanities approach, and using different methods than is often done in other medical research. And it's important because of those things that you're making sure that your grant is extraordinarily well explained, that that someone who has no background in those kind of things believes those things to be accurate, appropriate, and the best possible way to do it. I would say that's unfortunately, because of bias, even more true in a qualitative study than in a quantitative study. So those are kind of some of the few things I could think of.
Just a quick, I often think that there probably, as we were talking about, there are probably three categories. One is going to be experimental, and so that's really where you're doing some sort of an experimental design, where you're trying to prove some educational point or not. Those may be aligned with the science, like a more scientific or medical space, and so you might choose some of the things that you're looking at of how do you teach something that's meaningful in clinical practice. I think the other one is where it's much more focused, and those are going to be going to kind of the NIH, the American Heart, those sorts of things. There's also the experimental that's going more towards an educational, and so that's some of the work that John's doing, is looking at how do we teach and what are the outcomes. I think there's a third category that we need to remember, and that's that it's the pure educational things. You know, the couple of grants that I have gotten have been purely about, the couple of grants that I have gotten have been purely about how do you teach, and there is no experimental and no research design in that. And so so thinking about that in another way to do grants.
So great tips on just breaking it down to the three core frameworks, as well as the importance of the theoretical underpinnings. The next question is, for those of us who have not previously applied to grants before, what do you recommend as a good starting point, as a good leaping off point? Because many of us aren't going to go for an NIHK grant on their first try. So what's a good starting point to go from here?
I was voluntold for this. I just want to get a raise of hands. How many of you have never applied for any grant at all? Just a quick show of hands. And how many have done at least some sort of grant writing, development process, either as a co-investigator or as your own part of your own research? So I'm sure all of you have already had some experience looking into this. And that is always helpful, I think, as an initial start to get on other people's grants, because then you learn the process and you're just helping out before you kind of develop your own. I would say I remember the first time I tried to apply for a grant, it was just more in my own head, I was intimidated. You know, is this something that I even can do? Do I feel like I'm actually a worthwhile investigator? Do I have something meaningful to ask? And the way that I started out was just to start small. For example, it sounds like all of us have had some internal grants. I think your own department, your own institution, a lot of times wants to help you with your promotion process and have a lot of available resources to you, depending on where you are, I guess. But at least something internal will get you going, because your own department is hoping to help you get going, and you can kind of get your own reviewers. And then from there, you can look for smaller seed grants that potentially the rigor may not be as high of a bar, and then you can kind of get that going, get some of that feedback, and then go forward. But I think the first step is just to really think, okay, I have something interesting to ask, I'm going to kind of do it rigorously and just go ahead and dive in and get started.
So to kind of build on what Ambrose was saying, I think the biggest first step is, especially when you're new to the process, is really identifying a mentor that can really help you through the process. Because really going at this alone is a daunting task, especially when you have no experience, and that really adds to the fear or the kind of imposter syndrome. And, am I worth this grant? Do I have a question that's worth answering, like Ambrose said? So I think really identifying a mentor. And then I think it's also valuable to work with another individual, as Ambrose had mentioned, kind of learning the process before kind of going out on your own. And I think when you identify a mentor, it doesn't have to be at your institution. So someone that you admire, someone that's been successful, you reach out to them virtually even to ask for advice.
So great tips, getting over the initial hurdles of it, as well as the importance of mentorship and learning the process along the way. And that leads us to, how did you each find your own mentors when you were first starting out with your grants? And how do you find your mentors now if you still have that?
So I strongly believe in a mentorship team. One of my mentors is sitting to my left when Sally was at Michigan. But I've also sought out mentorship at the School of Education. I did graduate work there. I'm hoping to complete my graduate work this fall, or I'm probably going to be looking for a job from my chair. And then I also sought out mentorship with our kind of primarily research-focused faculty in my department, both health service research folks. I was part of a community of kind of junior researchers who did everything from the work I was doing to stroke research to one of my colleagues does nanoparticle coding on devices, which is, what I like to call real science, Star Trek science. And building that team that can bring those kind of different ideas, different reviews. I can't tell you the first time when one of the people that aren't education read one of my grants, they're like, I don't understand half of this, right? Because I was so embedded in the language of education and the nomenclature and the usual phrasing that they're like, I don't know what this means. And I can't tell you how important making those changes are. I really think that if you want to have a dynamic, interesting career, you have to not be a carbon copy of any one mentor. And so being successful is by building that mentorship team. I hope that's okay. Is that okay? Okay.
Yeah, I think just to echo what John said is that looking outside kind of who we would normally think to work with and reaching out and it takes a little bit of vulnerability to be able to have that relationship with a mentor who can really give you open and honest feedback about your career path, about your grant, about whatever it is that you're kind of putting together. And that does take some trial and error. So there may be some folks you think, gosh, I really want to work with them. You work with them for a little bit, and it's just not the right fit for mentorship. Doesn't mean that they're bad people or it's a bad relationship or anything like that, but not everyone that's in your space is going to be a mentor for you. It's finding that individual and putting yourself out there to be able to reach out, to connect, whether it's virtually, whether it's someone in your department, someone at the school, but kind of putting yourself out there to be able to start to make those connections, to have some mentorship. But it's, I think, really, really valuable when you have a team of mentors who can kind of help walk you through the process, who have been there before.
I was wondering if some of the rest of you could talk about your teams and your grants. So the components of it, how many people are involved in it, who you reach out to in addition to the mentor role.
I can get us started. So I think I would echo everyone's point about having a mentorship team, because I think in this day and age, for a grant to be successful, you need different types of experts on your actual proposal in order for people to feel like this is a valid grant and valid research question. So at least the big pockets that come to mind for me as I'm putting a grant together is someone that's related to the methodology. So for example, if you are asking a primarily qualitative research proposal, you would want someone who's actually been published and well-versed in qualitative methods, so that if you yourself are not that case, that you can say someone is rigorous and knows how to do that, or if you're using a specific framework, for example, that someone can do that for you. I think having someone that's potentially a content expert, so it sounds like, for example, you have a mechanical engineer who really brings in some valid additional information that a clinician might not, would be really useful. And then going back to the mentorship team, I think there's a difference between a mentor in the sense of what we think of in medicine and healthcare and what is a successful research grant mentor, because sometimes your mentor might be someone who is in your field and is really good at what they're doing, for example, in simulation, but they may not be a primary researcher. And they might be really good at helping you get your career going, but they're not going to help you get your grant successful. So you need to find someone that might be successful and well-published in research and can kind of give you that really honest feedback, like you're saying, to say, none of this makes sense. You don't have a science question here. You know, you might be really interested in asking how you teach students, but it's already been published 20 times and it's not going to be funded, right? So that someone's going to tell you that very explicitly, and you need to hear that loud and clear before the reviewers do.
And so as we talk about some of the key components of successful grant applications, I was wondering if each of you could share one kind of pearl or one thing you've learned along the way that you may not have known earlier that you wish you'd known that allowed you to be successful with future grants.
I think I brought it up a little bit, but the importance of form. Most of these things, you know, if you go to a grant writing workshop, they'll talk about replicating the exact same things. You know, if you go to like an NIH grant writing thing, they will break it down by section, and it'll feel like you're writing this kind of cookie cutter recipe thing. You are. And the reason you're doing that is just as we discussed, right? The AIMS page is the most important one page you're going to have in that whole grant, and what most people are going to read. It's the abstract times 1,000 of your paper. You can do the best work and be the most innovative, but if it's buried 3 pages into a background section, no one is going to read it. You really want to be very thoughtful about filling the format that they want, that they expect, and that there's not overlap, there's not redundancy. Oftentimes, a lot of these are going to be read by only a couple people, but they may be reading a lot of them. And if you make it hard or miserable to read or too long or not what they expect, you're done. So while we all have great ideas, the delivery is often, I think, something we're not that comfortable with, or we haven't done it that much, and great grant writers know how to make that delivery work.
I think it's the stuff you do before you go for the big grant. So number one, just make sure that you're publishing. You know, we all have the opportunities, and you're not going to get a bunch of grants unless you've got publications out there that people actually can recognize that you can perform and get stuff done. Probably within that, you need to have a non-eclectic and a single direction research focus. So I tend to be much more eclectic, which probably wouldn't help me in applying for grants, but thinking about, you know, this is the work that I'm doing, where I'm doing my work, and so that you're seen as able to do it. I think there's also, it's a lot of work to apply for these little small grants, the $2,000, $10,000 grants along the way. And sometimes it's tempting to say it's not worth it to do that work. And I think it probably is, because it's showing a track record of being able to do it. So the small internal grants, it's worth it to take that time to do it. But just make sure that you're going to do those projects anyway, and that's going to get to a publication. The grant along the way is just a little piece of work. I think those are the 2 things that I would say. And then it takes a lot of time, and so just remember that.
Yeah, so I would say my key points would be preparation. So especially when you're working with a large group of people, making sure you have a clearly defined plan amongst the team that can basically just be articulated in a very clear and concise way on the grant application. I would also say, kind of to echo what John was saying earlier, you really want to make sure, because the reviewers are multidisciplinary, you want to make sure that you're using language that's clearly articulated and understood by the reviewers who are certainly multidisciplinary. I think those are probably the biggest things that I would share that hasn't already been shared.
I'll probably be the most negative then of everyone up here, and I'll say right off the top that you probably won't get funded, which sounds very awful, right? But if the funding percent is somewhere around 5 to 10% for most grants, each and every one of us up here has written multiple grants that have not been funded. So if I had to go back and tell myself things more when I was starting to write grants, is that this is a good exercise. This project is going to continually be refined, but it may very well not be funded the first, second, third, fourth, or fifth time. But that doesn't mean that it's not valuable work. It's something that you internally, your team feels is important, and pursuing through that, taking the comments that you get back and turning it into a better product the next time is really valuable. So don't let the fact that if you are not successful on the first or second attempt, don't let that dissuade you if you feel passionate about the work that you're doing. Just use those comments to make it better even the next time.
Just to clarify, it's not that you're not going to get funded ever, right? You started off like, you've wasted your time. None of you will ever get money.
This isn't like absolute. This is just saying, I wish I'd had, I think I started very optimistic that I'm writing a grant, I'm going to get this one funded. Oh, that one didn't get funded. All right, I'm writing the second one, this is going to get funded. Oh, wait, that one still didn't get funded. So having a more realistic expectation for myself, I think would have been helpful. I probably would have spent less time crying when I first started. No, I'm just kidding. But it's just something to kind of think of when you're putting it together, is that this is a learning process, especially if you've not written many grants before. It's a skill like anything else that we learn. And being able to develop that skill and having the team around you to help is really what's going to ultimately make you successful in the long term, but it does take some time. There are some growing pains as you write those first several grants.
All right, so for the last roughly 10 minutes or so, we wanted to open. Oh, Ambrose, go
I
ahead.
was just going to echo what everyone said. I think the other thing is that the grant application process, at least obtaining grants and writing for grants, is really just a portion of you as a researcher and a scholar. I mean, you're not going to be successful in getting grants if you're not doing everything else, which is doing meaningful research, getting published, getting a research team together. And it's a cycle. I mean, the ideal process of a grant is that you have built on preliminary work that you've done and published, you're putting together a new question, and this funding is going to help you towards another completion of publications and research, and that's going to kind of go on to a bigger cycle. So you have to just remember that you have to finish that cycle out, and funders will often ask you at the end of the cycle, okay, great, you got some money, and what did you do with our money? And you want to show some work of dissemination. So, but that's why I think funders are also looking for rigorous science, because they want to make sure that the money they give to you, you will actually go through it and finish it and see it to completion. So just thinking about it as a cyclical process.
Great pearls from the group. For the last roughly 10 minutes, we wanted to open it up to the audience for questions that you have on your mind, or as well as any pearls, tips, and tricks that you've come across. Anyone?
Hi, thank you. So there are foundations that have missions that may not be primarily educational. They will sometimes have grants or announce, grant funding for things where you have to kind of meet their overall objective, which may not be primarily education. I'm thinking of like, Templeton Foundation or something where they're to try to understand what they're going to fund and look at what they funded. It's hard to figure out. Can you talk about how you can orient education grants towards some of the foundations that might fund education, but it may not be, clearly their objective?
So I think one of the common one that people do is the Macy Foundation, and so they do. I call it the Genius Grant, but they basically have a grant where they fund 50% of somebody's FTE for 2 years. It's very hard to get. They create this cohort of it, and so that one is each year they have specific priorities. And for the past couple of years, the Macy Foundation has been funding interprofessional education. And so for that one, you would do something like have a track record in interprofessional education or some other field, and then bring that into IPE. And so I think for each of these, it's important to look, as Brian said, look at what they're interested in and what changes they are trying to make, and then apply for a grant. And so it's mostly looking to see what they're doing. They also often have these, like the Macy also has something called a presidential grant, and that's one where you can just apply anything. So you basically have a conversation with them and say, what else, we're doing this, would you be interested in funding it? So sometimes they'll fund things that are not directly related to something that there is a call for. And to speak of that, that's something that we haven't actually mentioned. Talk to whoever's doing the grants along the way so that you can, like whoever the grant person is at the place that's doing it, because they will be one of your best allies.
Yeah, and I think kind of to Brian's point, sometimes you're going to be leveraging your educational expertise as part of a team where you're not the primary person that's looking for that grant. It may be that there is someone or a foundation that's looking for something where education is going to be part of that grant, and you could be successful as a co-I in those kind of things. You know, I'm a strong believer that medical education is it's the scaffolding in which our entire healthcare system is based on. And so there's a lot of ways that you can make an argument that our educational choices, our policies, kind of my research, have healthcare outcomes, have societal outcomes. There's ways to look at your work in different ways that might connect in with more funders, with different kinds of funders, with different research teams that may not be as narrowly construed as you might initially think. And so while we gave you kind of the list of people that primarily are in our world earlier on, that is by far not exclusive. And depending on what kind of work you do, there may be places where the flip side or the outcome or the theory or the population or the intervention all have some alternative funder. You know, like there, I think of like the Association for Institutional Research. That could be a funder for some of your work because you're doing institutional research, but that's not a MedEd funder. And so it's about kind of the overall discussion about linking your work to what they want to fund and building a team that can meet that need. And you may be the band leader or you may be playing second trombone, but you need to kind of figure that out.
Any other questions?
Is it helpful to be on a review panel, and is it helpful to find a mentor who is on a review panel?
I'd say yes to both those. I think the insight that you gain from, if you have an opportunity to sit on a review panel, is tremendous, because you hear some of the discussion of, well, why was this grant funded? Why wasn't this one funded? And sometimes that's not always articulated in the comments that you get back. And so if you have an opportunity to sit on one of them, I absolutely would take that. That's also helpful, though, if you have a mentor who's been in that position and can bring some of that information back to you. So I think those things are helpful. They're not essential, but they're things that will help you have a more competitive grant application if you have either or both of those.
Yeah, I think, you know, as we've talked about a lot, this is an iterative process, and by seeing more grants, by seeing more reviews, you accelerate that iterative process. It's not that I think it is necessary for you to be successful, like somebody's going to look and see if you're a reviewer to see if you're going to get funded. But the more grants I've looked at, the better my grant writing has gotten, and sometimes it helps to read grants that are nothing like what you're doing. You know, read somebody's K award about something else, right? Look how they explain the science that you don't necessarily live in to a way that you can understand it. So I definitely think the more experience you can get with success and failure, especially if you don't have to take the rejection yourself, right? I mean, that's the other thing about this is, man, it stinks getting rejected, and it's going to happen a lot unless you're like awesome, and I am not. And so being able to learn from someone else's mistakes, right? This person didn't get funded because this form wasn't in on time. That's it. They're done, right? Knowing that helps you to make sure your form's in on time.
So I would equate it to when you peer review papers for a journal. When you review other papers, it makes you a better writer. Makes your statistics and methods more sound. In the same process, when you review grants, it makes you better at writing grants. You identify the pearls and pitfalls of that specific grant, what's looked for, etc. So.
Any other questions or comments?
So there's some expertise in the room that we should probably call on. I see some strong, heavy hitter clinical researchers. Do people want to contribute about what their experience is? I'm not going to call anybody out or anything. No? All right. Cool.
All right, so one of the other questions that we had was, what have you learned from your failed grant applications, things that when you reflect back on it, you realize, wow, I realize that's why it got rejected, or that's kind of my personal grant M&M, if you will?
I have a lot of failure to draw on. So, you know, I think back on some of the reviews I got, and one of the things I think is you have to have enough time to be successful. Sometimes you try and push a grant out in a tight deadline, and your writing isn't as crisp, or it's not as clear, or you're trying to do too many things at once. And, you know, just the importance of having enough time to have enough reviewers, enough eyes, you know, any typographical thing, even small things really make a big difference on the impression you leave a reviewer with. And the cleanest or finest thing is going to help you whether the science is good or not.
Just not doing it at the last minute and making sure it's clean.
I guess one of the things that I think is a little bit challenging with it is when you write the grant, you can feel very vulnerable, and sharing it with people who are outside your circle of people involved in the grant can sometimes be challenging. So the first few grants that I had were really only reviewed by the team that I was working with, and the comments that came back were that whole sections were not clear, and we thought they were very clear as the team, as the investigative team, because we work with it, we do this sort of stuff all the time, but when it was read by somebody outside our team, it was not clear. And that was my fault as the PI, not being more willing to share it with people outside, and I think I felt vulnerable about it, that I didn't want people to, you know, I was very junior, I didn't have a lot of experience writing it, and so people aren't going to like it, I don't want to share it too widely. But now, as I've written more and more of them, I share them with more and more people to get feedback and comments on them, so that all those can be incorporated to make it an even better process when it actually gets submitted.
I was just going to add, I think paying attention to the grant agency is something that I didn't realize was really valuable to begin with. And at first I really felt like, okay, if I get the science right and if I really ask a good research question, that's going to be important. And that is, I think, really important, as we've all said. But the grant agency, like people have said in the introductory part of it, is looking for something specific. They're interested in funding specific things. They have priorities in place. So really look line by line at exactly every single thing they say. Sometimes they'll be like, in your proposal, you must address the soil and foiling. That actually is easy, because then you can just be like, okay, I'm going to exactly verbatim answer that particular question. Sometimes it's a little vague, because they may be looking for a couple different things and then decide that on the back end. So if you want to look at the past funded proposals, what have they been interested in before, and reaching out to the program officer. I didn't realize that program officers are just individuals that want to help you. You're supposed to go up to them and say, hey, look at my AIMS page. Like, hey, what do you think about this? And they're actually kind of part of your cheerleading team. So really pay attention to that before you even start thinking about where you're going to apply to.
So to kind of tie things up here, as someone who's failed at everything within a grant, I would say that having a clearly defined plan with your research team, and then having plenty of time to write it and refine it, I think is the only other things I would add, including echoing the other panelists.
I'd like to ask about any pearls you have to going off of what Ambrose said about, you know, especially some of these smaller seed grants that may be a particularly good fit for what you do. Pearls about how to discover what opportunities are out there and maybe a good fit for you, especially with some of the smaller initial seed grants outside of networking and word of mouth, if you have specific pearls along discovering those opportunities.
Yeah, I think look locally and see if there's things within your institution. So you have to ask, and then I think I think we have your emails, and I think we actually have a list of grant places. Is that correct? Sangil? Yeah. So if you give us your email, we'll actually send out a list of the stuff that we've got of the different grant opportunities, because I think they're little ones to do. There's like regional AAMC grants. There's small SAEM grants, there are EMF grants, there's cord grants. There's lots of little ones along the way, and you can get those. I mean, I got one when I was a resident, and so I think thinking about it that way. But we will send if everybody puts their name on the email list, we'll send out a list of the different opportunities.
But I think you've identified a real challenge. It is hard to know. There is no centralized location. We've tried to create some of that. You know, you brought up the idea of networking. I think being aware of the, you know, other things that are going on, your own ideas. If you're in a very specific area, being on their website, you could actually look and see and advocate for specific grants too. You know, there's a awards committee for SAEM, there's a grants committee for SAEM. New grants come on, things change, the funding mechanisms change. And then, you know, the sub areas, you know, like ADIM may have grants. So go to those sub areas that your most sub areas is not right. But anyway, you know, go to the places that your work does and see if there is something there. And if there isn't, see why not. See if there's a way to make that happen. You'd be surprised, I think.
Great. So I think we are running out of time. Thank you so much for coming today, and hopefully we covered some of the important aspects of a grant, such as mechanics, pitfalls, and tips. And we're gonna finish our session here, but our panel speaker will remain. So if you want to come over and have some discussion, I think we have about 10 minutes. But otherwise, thank you so much for coming.